Okay, good evening all, and welcome to tonight's meeting, Communities Committee. We'll go through the usual introduction, so to speak. This is a public meeting, and members of the public and press are permitted to report on the proceedings. Reporting includes filming, photography, making an audio recording, and providing commentary on proceedings. Please note this meeting is recorded and streamed live. These recordings are published on the relevant meeting page on the Council's website. By choosing to attend this public meeting, you are deemed to have given your consent to being filmed or recorded and for any footage to be broadcast or published. If the alarm sounds, the premises must be evacuated immediately. Do not spend time collecting personal belongings. All emergency escape routes are clearly signed, and once you've left the building, the assembly point is on the High Street opposite the Guildhall. Members and other speakers are reminded to use their microphone when speaking. Okay. Item 1, appointment of substitutes. Julian?
Yeah, no, we have no substitutes with us tonight.
Okay, thank you. Item 2, declarations of interest. I'll put my hand up straight away as item 6, as a modest landlord, and I suspect others will too. Okay. That's fine, thank you. Okay, item 3, public participation. None. And minutes of the meeting, 26th of January. I'll just go through them by page and then invite comment at the end, so to speak. Page 1, 2, 3, and 4. Anything there that anyone wishes to raise a point with? Happy? No? Good. Thank you. Okay, on to the substantive part of the meeting. Item 5, purple flag status. Some of you may be aware, others not. Sam McCarthy from the BID was due to be with us this evening. Sadly, she's unable to make the meeting, and we've decided to push that to, is it June we were going with, Lloyd?
It's the next.
Yeah, in June. So I don't know whether there's anything you want to add to that.
No, Chair, I think the decision was taken for it to move from Licensing and Environmental Health Committee to this committee, because this committee has oversight of community safety. And so we wanted to bring a short presentation along just to bring members up to speed on the purple flag process and the work that will be undertaken. That will continue. There was no decision associated with the presentation, it was just an update presentation, so that work will continue. We'll continue to work with Chair and Vice Chair on the project, and we endeavour as well to provide some briefing notes as we go through the process for this committee and for wider members, just to keep them up to date.
Thank you very much. Item 6. Oh, sorry, Jabba.
Thanks, Chair. Noted Sam couldn't make the meeting. I think it was a really good idea to add some sort of update on there, especially since they're going out on a purple flag visit on Friday evening. Whether we could have an interim report before that, just to highlight how they got on, because I think it's a really good news story.
Good, thank you. Item 6, review of the housing enforcement policy. Well, who was going to tee this one up? Richard. So I'll pass you over to Richard. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you all for the opportunity to present before you, and hopefully you've had an opportunity to have a look through the report and the proposed policy. I think it's important to highlight a few things. Firstly, the context that historically we've had an housing enforcement policy. First of all, back in 2014, updated over time. It is out of date and needs to be brought up to date with more recent legislative changes. So the enforcement policy does this as well as bringing together items that had been published separately on the civil penalty. The particular recent legislation I'd highlight would be electrical safety regulations and the energy enforcement regulations, but minimum standards for rented properties. So obviously it's important to have a clear, concise, up-to-date policy, transparent, fairness for the majority of landlords who are completely in line with requirements, and unfortunately the perhaps 2% of landlords who are failing to meet basic minimum standards. As with any market, there are people who are performing excellently and providing a great service that is absolutely needed by 20% of the households of the city who rely on the private rented sector, and of course our homeless team who we simply don't have the opportunity to place people as much as we used to in social housing. We have to rely on that private rented sector. So that reliance, we need to make sure those standards are fair and reasonable for those residents. And in particular, I'd like to explain the importance of the Mies, what we call the Mies Regulations, so the minimum energy efficiency standards. So to give you some context, from what we know from the data we've looked into, there's about 190 properties in the city that are below the minimum standard currently, which is a rating of F4G. And this, if you're not familiar with these ratings, it's kind of similar to if you buy a fridge or freezer, plastered on the front will be a rating between A and G, telling you how efficient that item is, and the same thing for properties. So the lowest scoring F and G properties will typically cost those residents a lot more to actually run than they will if they're an E or better. And we understand the aim of the government is to seek improvements from the minimum E standard there is at the moment up to D or C over the next few years. So it's an ongoing process. I'd like to also give the context that as well as an enforcement element for properties that are failing to meet the minimum standards, there are also grants, and a lot of work's being done within the team to try and promote those grants to help landlords who are already meeting the minimum standards to move towards the higher standards. To give you an understanding, again, of the context of the local housing market, I've looked into the local housing allowance levels and the typical market rents for 1-bed, 2-bed, 3-bed properties. And on average, the market rent for those properties is £100 a month more than the local housing allowance. So people on low income, people who are relying on benefits, are clearly having to meet those kind of shortfalls on a monthly basis. They're also the kind of people who are very likely to be spending a much higher proportion of their income on utilities and heating their homes than you or I. And if we make an improvement of an F or G property to an E rating, then that typically saves that person, that household, £60 a month, £50 to £60 a month. So and it's those kind of fine margins that are so important at the moment, with every knows the utility costs are going up by that kind of amount. So the overarching aim can be seen to be trying to help sustain or help keep sustainable tenancies, as well as ensuring the health and well-being of those residents, making sure they can actually afford to heat their homes. I think it's important we appreciate that context. I think I'd highlight that the policy has mechanisms in place there that follow national guidance, and these mechanisms are alternatives to court action. So rather than all the legal expense for a landlord and for the council in tackling substandard conditions, the mechanisms we now have in place through this enforcement policy allow for the council to inform the landlord of the issues and seek a response, and the landlord to give their reasons, any mitigation surrounding the matter before a final determination is made on whether it's appropriate to issue a penalty, fine, and how much that should be. And from work I'm also doing in the Wild Forest area along these lines, the kind of fines issued for minimum energy efficiency standards range from £100 or £200 up to £3,500. And embedded in that has to be a judgment, has to be an explanation and reasoned fairness to landlord and also to the tenant regarding the situation. And we have had situations where, particularly small-scale landlords who, we're not out to penalise the landlord, we're out ultimately to make sure the improvements are made. We've had situations where a landlord has turned around and said, I hadn't appreciated I needed to make these improvements, as well as making the improvements. They've reduced the rent or paid to the tenant the amount of money that, in effect, that tenant has had to pay extra because of the standards of the property. And in that kind of situation, we've then foregone issuing a penalty notice based around the amount the landlord's made off the property or the harm that's occurred to the tenant. But we may have still issued a modest penalty just to make sure we're covering the costs of the service. So to give you a sort of context and example how we're trying to balance the need to make sure there's improvement while also being fair and reasonable with landlords. And ultimately, they still have the opportunity to go to tribunal if they don't agree with the case that the council puts. So we're aiming to make sure all landlords are informed through an upcoming newsletter to landlords, and also we have a landlord forum scheduled for the 5th of May. That's an online forum. We will also seek to have another forum later on in the year, hopefully actually face-to-face, recognising that a lot of landlords do welcome the importance of networking at such events. So that's how we'll try and ensure landlords are further informed about the requirements. Another aspect of the enforcement policy is just to clarify the scope of enforcement of the private sector housing team, to give a bit more detail about the kind of legislation and areas of work. So that it extends from previous versions of the enforcement policy. They're a bit more narrow in their definition. So that will help in work on things like empty properties. Of course, we'll use a greater range of powers and tools to work on them. Yeah, that's all I've got to say to sort of introduce and give some understanding of the reasons behind it. I'm very happy to take any questions that councillors have.
Good. Richard, thank you. Any questions or comment, please? I've got Matt Lamb.
Just a question of clarification. Under 2.13, it says, from the 1st of April 2020 became an offence to let out property of an energy efficient rating lower than an E without a valid exemption. Can you give me an example of some of those valid exemptions? Because the devil's office in the detail with these.
Yeah, they're set out in the legislation. They include, for example, if you've got a listed building where the works to improve the energy efficiency would alter the fabric of the building and you can't do it because of the listed nature of the building, that would be a valid exemption. Another genuine valid exemption is if the landlord's made what improvements they can, but the next step in terms of improvements would be works that would cost more than £3,500. So we've seen some properties where, for example, they can do some minor bits and pieces like changing the light bulbs for more energy efficiency ones, but fundamentally the next step would cost more than that cap in place. There is also the scope that, genuinely if a tenant is turning around saying, I really don't want the improvements and they're refusing to have them, and obviously that can be the case. What we do is we'd obviously try and persuade the tenant, because it's in their interest to have the property improved and it should cost them less to run. But also, we can work with the landlord and say, okay, well, upon change of tenancy, make sure, get those works done before that new tenant comes in.
Okay, thank you. Lynn Denham, please.
Thank Thank you very much, and thank you for the clear explanation. It's housing enforcement policy and enforcement on the private sector has been a key priority for some of us for some time, and very much aware that there are properties that are problem properties and within the city. So if we know that there are 190 properties with who are below the minimum energy efficiency standards, are we able to act directly as the local authority, or do we have to wait for a tenant to complain?
Thank you. It's a really good point. A lot of the work of the team historically has been around, obviously, the licensing of houses and multiple occupation, and then responding to complaints that come in. For the energy efficiency regulations, we're able to act, we're able to access that data, and we are going direct to landlords. So it's not as a result of any complaint that tenants have made. In fact, I'm not aware we're having any complaints coming in from tenants saying, I could do with a more efficient heating system, or I don't think the walls are insulated. They would tend to come to us with complaints such as, I'm getting a lot of mould, can you help me? And obviously we would look at the energy performance of the building in that background context to see actually, what is there behind this? But we are tackling all those 190 over time, and it's just a question of resources within the team and working through them. So we've looked at all the exempt or claimed exemptions first, and we're working our way through those, and then we'll be working our way from the sort of worst performing properties up and going through them all.
Just to say though, Chair, and Richard can clarify, I think when this legislation was introduced, paper actually to this committee, sure that we were advised and delegated. I think Richard can clarify, we have written to all landlords, council of Denham, are of a certain category and below, making them aware of the legislation and almost a beware we're coming message, if that makes sense.
Okay, thank you. I've got Tom Collins and then Mike Johnson.
Yeah, I've got a few things to go through. Is it all right if I cover them all in one go rather than keep coming back to you? Okay, thank you. So on energy efficiency, this is just a clarification really. Anecdotally, from young people who are renting that I've spoken to, there seems to be an increase in landlords restricting access to the heating controls in a building in order to try and prevent people from turning up the heat too often. This might apply to HMOs, I'm guessing. Is that something that we can and do enforce? People's access to control their own heating?
Simple answer is yes. The tenants must be able to control the level of heat, albeit it's totally understandable. A landlord may well set up a timer and controls on the heating system and then lock that away. And all the HMOs we deal with, we ask to make sure that they've got thermostatic control valves on the radiators in their room, so they can use that to vary and control the heat, but we'd expect there to be sufficient in the system for them to allow to use that. It's a bit of a balancing act, because in fairness to the landlords, costs are going up astronomical. At some point, they can absorb those. At some point, they're going to have to pass some of that on, where the landlords are paying the heating bills, and that's typically, in houses and multiple occupation.
Thank you very much. The next question of mine is, you've mentioned targeting in this, which I understand about how we target inspections, but I wondered if there's room for a slightly more descriptive element in the policy about what are our methods of detection. There's a lot here about what we do once a non-compliance has been detected and how we respond. Complaints aren't the only way we go detecting, nor I guess are just inspections, so there must be a way that we what are our approaches to detection? It'd be useful to see that detailed somehow.
Yeah, I think what we're looking to do is we're undergoing a review of the private sector strategy, and I think it's probably more appropriate to get into our strategy document a description of the tools we've got and how we're going to prioritise those. So, for example, obviously at the moment we're going through data around the energy performance certificates, and we'll also be looking at other tools we've got. For example, I've said this evening about walking down the streets, seeing streets where we know there are houses of multiple occupation, seeing where the lights are on, helping identify places, talking with the bins service, making sure they highlight to us any properties where they're aware they're using multiple bins or the bins are always overflowing, that would indicate there's lots of people living in the property. We've got ability to use council tax to cross-check properties that are, multiple properties all with the same person paying the council tax, which would indicate a house in multiple occupation. The thing is, there are a lot of different tools and strategies, and I think we'll use the private sector housing strategy, I believe, to help formulate those, including things like our relationship and work with the police and across the teams. So I think you're right. I think we do need to address that and prioritise how we're working and who we're trying to assist. And I think we'll work it through that mechanism, if that's okay.
Super, thank you very much. And while you mentioned all of those things, actually a topic that's been close to my heart has been the issue of modern slavery, and actually, detecting unregistered HMOs is an important step in detecting that. So that's really good to hear you're using that creative set of measures, and I look forward to that work developing as you described. There only one more thing I have to ask about. I'm really glad to see helpfulness in here in 4.5, but my immediate kind of response to that was I wonder if actually there's a bigger thing to say under that in terms of accessibility, equality and inclusion, and making sure that we, in dealing with everybody we work with, that we explicitly state that we'll protect their dignity and work with empathy and respect, and that we'll adapt our communication to meet people's specific needs, including maybe formatting format of information and advocacy if needed, and access to face-to-face communication, which I'm sure we already do, but it'd be wonderful to see that written in our documents and codified so that we hold ourselves to that level.
Can I just check, is that statement copied across from other council documents? Is it there may be a sort of corporate statement we can either incorporate into it, or we can take what you said? I mean, I completely agree with it, and it takes it on from, rather than just a bland statement, it gives it more meaning. So
super. That's just, those are a few notes I dropped down. I'm happy to share them with you, and maybe my suggestion would be that we key in Sian, who's working on this already, and get her steer on it. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. I've got Mike Johnson.
Thank you, Chair. This is probably a question more for Lloyd. On two counts, have we got any data that benchmarks where we sit? One, in terms of the whole of the estate and its quality, whether it's private or public. And two, the effectiveness of enforcement. Because this is sort of in isolation. I don't know whether it represents really good practice or average practice. So where do we sit in the scale of things?
If I take the second one first, Chair, again, I'll ask Richard to come in on the back of me. I'm not aware of any benchmarking information around housing enforcement. I've been out of the game for a little while. So Richard may want to come in on the back of it. In terms of our private sector stock and the condition of it, obviously we have carried out periodic house condition surveys. We were due to carry one out in the last couple of years, but COVID has come along and sort of taken over things. But that's something we want to bring back to this committee. We've had previous approval to go out and carry another one. So that gives us a really rich source of information. And obviously, as part of the South Worcestershire Development Plan, we have something called the Strategic Housing Market Assessment that's carried out, and that provides us with quite a bit of data as well. So that information is there. It needs to be periodically updated. And again, that's something we can bring back to committee at some stage. I may turn to Richard for that one, but I think my time in Worcester is we're a classic urban area. You know, we have probably a higher proportion than private rented properties in a lot of areas, and that comes with good and bad. But Richard, have you got a more?
Yeah, looking through the information we've got, there was a stock condition survey undertaken quite a few years back, and a desktop exercise was undertaken in 2021, but that looked to refresh certain data around the level of HMOs and things like that. But it didn't produce a definitive what percentage of the stock got a category 1 hazard, for example. We do have the data on the energy efficiency, which we can compare to other areas. And that's, we can use that as part of the strategy to also inform areas to work in and the kinds of local housing stock that needs improvement. I think we do need to look to get an up-to-date stock condition survey done that does involve some boots on the ground, assessing certain areas and bring that information together, certainly. And in terms of enforcement activity and also that local stock, we know we've got a high level of houses and multiple occupation, we've got a high level of student activity. The vast majority of the interactions we're having as the team with that stock, the properties are in good condition, or the issues we're coming across are about repairs and maintenance and keeping up to date on current requirements, that we're not coming across lots of big issues. The thing we're most concerned about is to make sure we have the ways of tapping into what are the hidden problems. What is it that we don't know? And that's the challenge through all those different techniques. I think, to give you a comparison, not all local authorities are actively enforcing the minimum energy standards yet. I am working maternity cover for Ismainie half the week, and I also work at Wyre Forest. Wyre Forest was one of the first pilots, so they're a year ahead of us. Redditch and Bromsgrove haven't actively started it yet. They're doing it on a reactive basis, case by case, picking up some. But in Wyre Forest, over the course of the last year, they've issued about 40 or 50 compliance notices, and now about 20 or so actual fines, penalty notices, with that sort of range of a few £100 to about £3,500. So, and that doesn't represent all the cases that they're working on. But it's something we've talked about, resources in the team, and that, prioritising, and it'll be, I'm very keen to we have a strategy in place, and it may well be subject to review as we learn more about the stock and how we should be prioritising.
So, from your subjective view, having worked in both authorities, where do we sit? Are we better or are we worse? Have we got more enforcement? Have we got less?
I think we've got a large amount of activity on reasonable landlords, helping them maintain those reasonable standards for a very important area of work, which is the HMOs. I think historically that's probably taken over the core role of the team, and we seem to have less direct complaints coming to us of poor housing conditions. But I think what I'm keen to find out is what's the hidden, because I'm sure there will be. And that's where I think we need to do a piece of work now to catch up and create some time and energy around that work, using the data that we can get to have what now, the trendy word is an intelligence-led approach to finding out. So I'll tell you when we find out over the next few years, I think.
Jabarius.
Team, if we do send out enforcement notices to all these properties, how quickly is like a case that isn't enforceable likely to come to case, and how much is it going to cost us per case in order to get to that stage? I suppose that's question number one. The second question would be, in terms of, it would be really helpful if after this, if we decide to approve this tonight, that a flow chart of a timeline of events of what you could expect if you don't enforce. So it's just laid out plain clear, whether it'll be on our website or a media campaign, to make sure that everybody starts becoming aware and starts taking notices, a notice of action. And thirdly is in terms of, you mentioned those that are meeting the minimum requirement of E, is it? That's right, E. And you mentioned something about support available to landlords to get them to the next level. That will be really helpful to have some more information about that as an incentive to those to get them into that next level.
Okay, I've got Stephen. Did you want to come back on that, Richard? Yeah.
Thanks. So firstly, in terms of costs, obviously, historically, the way housing enforcement used to work would be driven through the courts, and if we serve a notice, the appeals will be through the courts. The mechanisms in here, we're pushing to look at civil penalty route rather than going to court, because that reduces the council's costs, it reduces the landlord's costs. The tribunal, the inbuilt here is an internal review mechanism first, whereby any case that's put together, the landlord is notified. They have the opportunity within a month to come back and give us their side of things, what we need to consider. That then goes to a senior manager. So typically that might be Tom, or it might be Lloyd, and that they will review that information, and typically that may take a couple of weeks or so. There might be more information we want from the landlord, and then a final decision from the council goes out, and then that is still open to a tribunal request by the landlord. So it condenses time, and it reduces costs and reduces the potential court involvement.
Sure. Just what I wanted to say was, Chair, it's not going to cost us more in trying to pursue a claim than to get any money back. If you see what I'm saying.
Yeah, in effect, no. And what's quite helpful is, particularly with the Mies, all the data and the information is there. It's just a question of putting it together. In terms of timescales, so some of those timescales are driven by the legislation. But yeah, we can absolutely make sure that a simple example can be given and set up on the website, so people understand how things are being dealt with. In terms of the grants and assistance, the government seems to change it every 5 minutes, and they've introduced a fairly complicated system. If any of you know about the LAD scheme and the green home stuff, then there's been a lot of top-heavy bureaucratic requirements put on it. Officers in the team are doing their best to achieve what they can, to channel money through to local low-income households predominantly. That does include the private rented sector, and Madeline and the team set specific targets to achieve for the private rented sector as well. Those schemes at the moment, they tend to not provide all the funding, but sort of 2/3 or 3/4 of it. And I say that they keep changing. That there's a new scheme coming in from April, May time, which we're working on trying to put together as well. So I think we just have to make sure when we talk to the landlords, so that the May landlord forum, I'll be running a session about Mies, and I'll be including any information we've got up to date then for landlords around the grants, what's available.
Okay, thank you. I've got Stephen, Marjorie, then back to Lynn.
Okay, apologies if I say something that's already been said, but I'm struggling to hear this meeting because this loop system doesn't work properly. Right? Having read through the housing enforcement policy, it's obviously going to more likely hit those who have older properties, because in Warndon parishes where I represent, all our properties are post 1990, and I would suggest probably will be absolutely fine in terms of what this policy is actually stating. In terms of the fine, I take it obviously the first course of action is ideally to deal with it through the civil penalty system, because the prosecution is an expensive and lengthy process. And the systems, I take it, the system first of all have a system of appeal for the landlord. Also, is an incentive, for example, a deduction in the amount of fine if somebody pays sooner rather than later than dragging on, like you do, for example, with a parking fine if you pay it within a certain number of days. And also, especially in the case of repeat offenders, will they report this committee in the next year of how this is actually progressing in terms of what sort of level of sanctions we're actually getting, and also if they are bad examples, are we going to be putting out communication to almost like make the public aware that we take action against effectively rogue landlord, and also as a way, an extra disincentive if landlords are not providing properties to the standard laid out in the policy.
Thank you for those points. I think you're probably right to a great extent. The more modern the property, the more likely it is to meet current building regs, and in effect, that's the standard we're hoping to achieve whenever we ask for improvements where it's feasible. In terms of issues like repeat offenders, yes, clearly, as part of the consideration of aggravating and mitigating factors, the scale of a landlord, the size of their stock, and whether there's been previous history can be taken into account. There isn't explicit a mechanism to reduce or have a lower fine if it's paid within a certain amount of time. However, I think what we can do is for built in is any first-time offence will be dealt with as a first-time offence, so that in itself will be mitigation. In terms of publicity, I think absolutely yes. I know enough about the area to appreciate that the landlord forum has been quite active in the past. There's a lot of communication between landlords. Landlords, if one or all landlords appreciate this is the current reality, these are the steps that need to be taken, that word will spread. And I think key as part of that is part of the policy is and the consideration of an appropriate level of fine if we do issue one, is that the landlord should not be profiting from failing to meet the required standards. And hopefully that message will go out and the landlords will see that we are actively pursuing. So for the F&G properties, it really is a matter of time till we get round to them all. So if there's any landlord out there with an F&G, that the sooner they sort it out, the better, and that is the best mitigation they can do at this point.
And Marjorie.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for your report. I'm really pleased to see this come forward and that action is going to be taken, reasonable action and fair action against landlords who don't meet these standards. I've just got a couple of points about the actual report where I wasn't quite clear. First of all, in section 5.7, you start off, you say when a landlord is prosecuted, and then that person from managing rented property. Being a landlord and being a manager are not the same thing. So do you actually mean banning from being a landlord? And the other, do you want me to ask you the other one first, next? And the other one is, could you explain what a publication penalty is? That's in Appendix 4. It's mentioned several times in paragraphs A to D.
Thank you, yes. Firstly, in regard to banning orders, it is the case that the banning order can't, if we come across a landlord who's so bad that, and we've had repeated offences, it's an option for us to use. It's kind of a last resort, really. If we issue a banning order, we can't stop the landlord owning that property and therefore being the landlord. What we would do is that order would effectively ensure that person is one step removed from the management, day-to-day role of managing the property. So the expectation would be they would have to employ somebody to manage the property. So it stops their management, which is activities such as the letting and the dealing on day-to-day basis of repairs and dealing with the tenants. So the simple step for that landlord would be to just hand it over to an agent who's part of a redress scheme, etc., and can professionally and properly then manage that property. The publication penalty, yeah, it's included in the legislation. It's not something that we'd rush to utilise much. It effectively says that if we decide that a landlord has broken the rules around the minimum energy standards, as well as issuing a fine of a certain decided level, we can also publish their name on a national register. And to be honest, we're not entirely sure of the purpose and use of that national register. It can inform other local authorities if a landlord was working across different areas. It's a sort of name and shame sort of thing. But it's not, for example, in Wyre Forest, we've not chosen to use that yet on any of the landlords we've targeted, because we felt it's been enough to deal with them direct and sort issues out. It's something we'd probably reserve if we felt we had a large-scale landlord who's working across different areas, and we wanted to use that to literally publicise their failure to respond.
Thank you. I just like to say it would make it would have a lot more impact if it was published sort of locally rather than nationally.
And Liz.
Yes, thank you. And I was going to ask sort of similar to Margie around the banning orders. I mean, thank you for the report and for your very kind of helpful explanation. It's been really quite informative. I mean, it's interesting that you say that, you know, numbers of complaints are relatively minimal. I think from the experience of a number of us would be that tenants are frightened to complain, stopped complaining. So really pleased to hear that with regard to the EPC, that's not an obstacle. Is it still the case that a tenant would have to complain about, you know, other poor standards before we were able to take enforcement action? And if, you know, if there is a tenant brave enough that comes forward and complains, are we able to look at other properties by the same landlord? Let's face it, if they're, you know, not looking after property X, the chances are that, you know, if they also own Y, Z, etc., that those may not be up to standard. And could I also suggest, because I know Councillor Riaz and I did a sort of a bit of lobbying over the years to get more information to tenants. So there has been a tenants leaflet. I don't know whether that is completely up to date. And if not, you know, could we ask for that to be updated with the current legislation? And I think, you know, there is also a need to look at that being in other languages. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. I think traditionally, can I put it, particularly where there's been a lot of demands upon the service, the priority has been dealing with HMOs, tackling those conditions, focusing on those, working to try and identify unlicensed HMOs, and yet responding to complaints. This does signal a shift using these tools to be more proactive. It is not the case that we are solely there to respond to complaints. If we have a reasonable suspicion that property is substandard, there is no reason that we have to have a complaint in order to investigate. But we must have reasonable grounds to look at the situation. Those reasonable grounds can be if we have a block of flats or whatever, and we know if there's an issue with one flat. In the Housing Act 2004, it actually says we have a duty to consider the surrounding housing conditions. So, yeah, actually, if we recognise there's a problem in one flat, we do need to consider all of them. So that is in place. Information to tenants, yeah, I think we can make sure we include that in the strategy, but we can also get on with that in the near future and see. One of the things I've appreciated here is there are, in terms of minority groups, there's a different sort of makeup within Worcester City to other parts of the county. Realising there's quite a Portuguese population in the city, which is kind of surprised me. How did that happen? But there's a lot of sort of local context. Yeah, how these things come about. So yeah, we do need to recognise we need to be able to reach those people who won't necessarily come forward to us and help them. I think there's an element of reassurance needed to those people, and also to landlords who also may need reassurance that it's okay to come forward and talk to us about the situation.
That's great, thank you. I mean, one question, excuse, from me, and I kind of echo the points that particularly Councillor Denham has made about reaching out to parts of the community that are difficult to reach, and we should continually endeavour to do that. You spoke, alluded to a couple of times the Landlords Forum, and it's a particular interest of mine that we try to engage with enough of the landlords, you know, modest portfolios, for want of a better way of describing it, who are outside of that discussion framework. I mean, I know many people come to the forum, and that's great to see, but if we can push to, you know, build that up as much as we possibly can. I know Ismini has done a lot of work in that respect, and, you know, but the more we can do, I think the better. Anyone else like to comment? Firstly, I'd like to thank Richard for some extremely informative responses there. It's great, excellent piece of work, and I'd also like to, I should have done this at the beginning, but welcome Richard and indeed Tom to committee. Look forward to working with you both as we go forward. Okay, happy to go on. So, in terms of 1.1 and 1.2, 1.1 is the noting, and 1.2 is formally approve the draft document. Can I have a show of hands to express approval of that, please? Thanks very much. And on to agenda item 7, the committee performance scorecard 22-23. Lloyd?
Thank you, Chair. Chair, this report presents the committee scorecard, proposed committee scorecard for next financial year. So it's a report that we bring members each and every year. And it's the scorecard that contains key projects and key performance indicators that committee can hold officers to account on and sort of have that high-level oversight of performance. Page 31, Appendix 1, is the document that I'd draw your attention to. And Chair, if I may, perhaps if we can cover off the key projects first and then take questions, and then perhaps move onto the performance indicators later on. So in terms of the key projects and activities that we're looking to carry over from this year into next year, there are 3. The Worcester City Community Engagement Strategy, so the work that we've commenced doing around asset-based community development and the way we engage with our communities. Chair and Vice Chair went down to Gloucester on a visit to see the work there. We'd like to now sort of bundle that up into a sort of very clear and articulated strategy for the city, so that all our stakeholders can understand and engage with how we want to approach that. So that's a piece of work that we want to continue with for next year. We wish to develop a housing enabling strategy off the back of the ARC Commission project that we're undertaking. We have that draft report now with officers, and we'll be hoping to sort of communicate that with members soon and run another briefing session, and then turn that into action, basically. So that's one for next year that we're proposing as well. And then the third on there is the next steps accommodation of rough sleepers, accommodated through COVID-19. So again, over the last 4 or 5 months, this time it was called Protect and Vaccinate. Tom and the team, prior to Tom's arrival, we placed a number of rough sleepers into the Seven View Hotel, and now we have the responsibility to give them a better placement and move on for the next stage of their journey. And again, that process will continue over the next several weeks and possibly months to ensure they get that move on option. So there are 3 that we wish to carry over into the next financial year. If I then focus on the ones that we're proposing to remove, the 4 there, which we've marked as completed, I don't intend to spend any time on those, and hopefully members will recognise those as being complete. The 2 that I did wish to just sort of focus on, the community recovery strategy. Apologies for the error. I've said they're reported on biannually to Communities Committee. That now sits with Health and Wellbeing Committee. So that's the reason for it being taken off this scorecard, or proposed to be. And obviously the same for the recommendations for the Child Poverty Task and Finish Group. That is now sitting under Health and Wellbeing Committee. So that's the reason for proposing that those 2 come off. And in terms of the new projects for next year, we're proposing that the capital budget allocations that were approved as part of budget setting, they remain. They now go onto a scorecard to progress those through to business case stage. Coma Gardens, the Albury Mount project, and the Northwick Park, Northwick Lodge artificial cricket wicket. We feel the Purdeswell Leisure Centre replacement floor tile project is important enough, critical enough for it to be on the scorecard. I'm sure members will want to be kept abreast of that. And the one, again, we wish to propose for next year is the acquisition of additional temporary accommodation. So this committee, probably 2.5 years ago, approved and give the green light for us to increase the amount of temporary accommodation. I think we said 64 units. We made a great start. COVID came along, and we've not done a great deal since. We've been doing other things, obviously, but we need to re-kickstart that again and get stuck into that. So we want to put that back on for this year. And the one, Chair, that we've omitted and we wish to add at this late stage is the Purdeswell 3G artificial pitch. There were conversations around where that sat. We've now concluded those, and we feel it sits best with this committee, because this committee has a history of dealing with capital projects of that nature. So we also wish to propose bringing the Purdeswell artificial pitch project to business case stage for inclusion for this year. So happy to stop there on projects, Chair, and take any questions.
Okay, any questions on projects? I've got Stephen Hodgson, and then open it up to the room.
Yes, my question is really quite simple, really. Looking at these PIs, particularly the new ones for 21-22, particularly some of them relating to, for example, total homeless households placed in B&B accommodation, the one on that list there. We need to be quite careful how we actually select these, Because obviously it's a double-edged sword on this in terms of what you want to record, not so much the crude figures, because they actually indicate the level of the problem, but actually they need to be designed to show the effectiveness in terms of how we're actually dealing with it. Because really that is what we're looking at. There's two sides of it. One is obviously to understand the level of cause, but also then to track how well we're actually dealing with it. So what I would say is when these PIs are being confirmed, to bear that in mind, so that next year or later on in the year we're asking the question, well, this doesn't actually prove how effective we are, because I know from past as many years as chairman of PMBS how some metrics don't actually prove what you're actually trying to get.
Chair, thank you, Councillor, for that. I think what we've done in including those PIs this year, and Tom may want to comment, is they are nationally recognised PIs around this sort of area and work. And if you put all the PIs that we're proposing for next year, if you put them in a line, hopefully what you find is that we can see the number of people coming into the service. So actually what's coming through the door, the number of people that we're preventing, so they don't get to that sort of real crisis stage. The number of people we're helping out of temporary accommodation, if we have had to place somebody there. But the items around the number of people in temporary accommodation and particularly B&B accommodation, that then links back to us not having enough affordable accommodation. So what I wanted to do is sort of really make that link between us needing more temporary accommodation, more affordable accommodation, and some of those numbers driving a better conversation at committee. And for the last couple of years, we've not presented that data, and really that's some of the there's some of the key indicators that drive sort of service level conversations, and what we wanted to get into a committee forum.
Any further comment on projects specifically? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Just picking up on the ABCT model, it's obviously too late to do it this sort of meeting, but it'd be really good to have Jenny down from Gloucester and the team down to Gloucester to talk about how they developed that model. I think it's really useful that this committee see it, and if not the full council, in terms of what they've done, invite them across, and maybe we can show them to a couple of projects that we've been working on to just for best practice. I think it's critical that the rest of the committee see that work and how individual members can then possibly relate that into their own wards and see the benefit of that and debate and discuss.
Yeah, Chair, I was just going to say, I think probably putting the strategy together, we may not get there for next committee, but certainly one of the things that we want to do is to bring members up to speed on on what asset-based community development is, what it involves, the type of work it will see us doing, because it is a concept that for some it takes a bit longer to get heads around than others. It certainly did with me as an officer. But we've started to do it. The team are sort of living and breathing it almost, and we've not sort of communicated that with members yet. So I think even a holding paper for June committee would be helpful in advance of a strategy, and we can certainly see if colleagues from Gloucester can come along and talk about their experience.
Definitely. Any further comment specifically on the projects, or okay, Lloyd, did you want to just?
Yeah, of course. Thank you, Chair. Chair, many of the KPIs from last year are currently being proposed to be carried over. So again, members of this committee will recognise those, so I don't wish to sort of dwell on them. In terms of new key performance indicators for next year, we would like to put one in around asset-based community outcomes. And some members may comment that perhaps the so what question, but I think this goes to the heart of what asset-based community development is. So that will very much be around the number of conversations that we're having as a community engagement team and as a council with communities, the number of groups formed, You know, and it's those types of indicators. At the moment, it will be very much output, not outcomes. But as we grow that, that should change. So that's certainly one we wish to propose. And I think I won't dwell on the answer I provided Councillor Hodgson around the reason for the new housing indicators. So yeah, happy to take any questions, Chair.
I just like to ask a question about linking the previous item on housing enforcement to these KPIs. In other words, should we have some KPIs to measure how we're getting on with housing enforcement? And I think we should. I'm sure I don't need to come up with examples. I'm sure you could do a much better job of that than I could. But I think, you know, some measurement here will be useful. So,
Chair, we do have 3 indicators included that covered some elements of housing enforcement. And again, some of these are nationally recognised. So we've got one around the percentage of HMOs licensed. And then we've got 2 that cover the number of category 1 hazards and category 2 hazards that we are removing through our intervention. So there are 3 indicators there. Richard may want to comment, but I think the risk of going any further, we get so much into the detail that it probably becomes an operational matter for officers, but Richard may want to comment.
I think what may be useful, I know the councillors have alluded to the desire to see, okay, if we have this enforcement policy in place and we're looking to tackle the energy efficiency levels, can we come back with some sort of report or something to say what that actually achieved? So I think that may be more a suggestion that once we've got our strategy in place and worked out how we're going to use the tools and prioritise, I think perhaps a qualitative report and something back to committee to demonstrate what's been achieved over time on the various strands and the strategy, and then that may well lead into an actual sort of a numbers, a figures, a quantity that we're looking to try and work on. But I'm not sure we're there yet to be able to predict one at the moment, if that's okay.
Thank you. I wondered whether there's any value in having the number of people actually on the housing list. I mean, I presume that's a different figure to the people owed a main housing duty. Yes, absolutely, because you know, we're aware of pressure on that. We're aware of people living in suitable accommodation and access. I think that could be a really useful kind of tracker or an indicator of the pressure for affordable housing within the system. And we don't routinely see it.
Yeah, again, Tom may wish to comment. It's an interesting one. I think it was one several years ago that would feature quite heavily in councils' performance scorecards or similar for whatever authorities had within their own remit. But it's not one that seems to be reported on much anymore. We can certainly report it. I suppose my one concern would be that let's just pick a number, of the 4,000 people on the waiting list, a proportion of those will be in need, and a proportion of those will desire a move. So it's just, I think that, you know, if we were to include it, the narrative around it would be really important, because there are quite different sort of cohorts within that group. But you know, it's something that we have. We can easily press a button and produce it, and if members wish, we can present it. But lying beneath that is a very complex project. Tom, do you want to?
Yeah, I'd sort of echo that point really, that I think it doesn't provide a huge amount of context. Yes, demand, but doesn't necessarily show. I think that it does reflect our allocations policy and how we apply need and how we allow. Like I said, the information's there and ready.
Tom Collins. Sorry,
just to say, I mean, I think absolutely understand it's a reflection of the housing. For individuals, there is a balance. There's perception, isn't it, between need and desire. So, you know, it might be in terms of the formal systems. It'll be the people that are emailing, feel they're in desperate circumstances and absolutely desperate.
Tom Collins.
Thank you. I had 2 points. The first one was the one Lynn just made, but I wonder if, in an aim to kind of progress this to a firm conclusion, what if we made it, for example, the number of people in band 1 and 2 waiting for? Would that be a reasonable metric that we could use?
Yeah, more than happy to take Councillor Denham and Councillor Collins' point away and perhaps work with you and Councillor Riaz on an indicator that captures both.
I think that's
both elements.
Yes.
Is that
absolutely? Yeah.
Thank you very much. And my second one was on the target for private sector dwellings where hazards have been removed. Bearing in mind that one of our previous reports pointed out that of mandatory licensed properties, 92% required works to overcome a significant hazard before we issue the licence. That indicates that there's probably quite a high level of non-compliance in our stock, and 5 seems like quite a low number. Whether that's a reasonable target and whether we want to increase our ambition there at all.
I think, thank you, Councillor. I think realistically, when you measure something, it's all about actually how you're measuring and what it is you're actually measuring. And my understanding is that number is actually in relation to complaints we've had in where we've then gone and inspected and identified there is a Cat 1 hazard arising out of that inspection of complaints, rather than the work we're doing on houses of multiple occupation, where we tend to be identifying issues and working with the landlords to resolve them, but not through the formal health and safety rating system and notices. So kind of skewed the figures, and we have been discussing, we'll look as part of the strategy of how we can recognise the broader work of the team at improving private rented stock. So, every property where we make that improvement on the energy efficiency is almost certainly removing a Category 1 hazard. So we need to do some work in the teams, I think, about what we're recording and how we're recording it to better give a reflection of the outcomes for those residents. So we'll look at that.
Thank you, Richard. Cheers. Thank you.
Any further comment? No, thank you. So we're asked to consider the proposed content of the scorecard, and we have done. So to move on, I'm not aware of any other business this evening. So that said, I'm happy to conclude the meeting. Thanks very much for your time.